At 6:30 a.m. inside Dallas Love Field before 2:46, stunned passengers Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett was humiliated. While her husband retired, federal judge Franklin Rhodes walked straight into the chaos. What began as a simple boarding pass dispute ignited into a national reckoning, caught on 18 cameras echoing through every corner of America. When dignity collides with power in plain sight, whose side will history choose? In the next few seconds, you will witness the truth that they never wanted the public to know. The terminal at Dallas Love Field pulsed with the rhythm of an early morning rush. Rolling suitcases clattered against polished tile, boarding calls crackled over the speakers, and the faint smell of burnt coffee lingered from a kiosk 2 gates away. To most, it was just another day, another flight to catch before the sun had fully risen. But for Jasmine Crockett, it was a moment already fraying at the edges. Her eyes carried the exhaustion of weeks of back-to-back hearings. Her steps carried the weight of grief as she tried to reach a family funeral, and her patience carried only the thinnest thread of control. She arrived at the gate with her boarding pass ready, her government ID tucked neatly beside it. The line shuffled forward, one passenger after another, moving through without pause. But when Jasmine reached the counter, the air shifted. The gate clerk, a young man with a practiced, tight smile, took her pass and frowned at his screen. His fingers moved over the keyboard slower than necessary, pausing deliberately as if each keystroke was a choice. He glanced up, and for a moment his smirk lingered longer than courtesy allowed. "I'm not finding your reservation," he said, his voice deliberately loud. The passengers behind her shifted impatiently, craning their necks toward the disruption. Jasmine pressed her lips together, her composure masking the sting of fatigue. "It's confirmed," she answered evenly, sliding her ID across the counter. "Check again." The clerk picked up the ID, studied it as if it were counterfeit, then set it back down without scanning it. "Random system glitch," he shrugged, but his tone lacked sincerity. His hand hovered over the keyboard, but he didn't move. The line behind her began to murmur, whispers rippling in growing waves. A woman pulled out her phone, holding it chest high, the camera already blinking red. Jasmine inhaled slowly, her shoulders tightening. She had seen this performance before, the subtle playbook of delay, of making someone visible for all the wrong reasons. "You're saying I can't board?" she asked, the edge in her voice sharper now. The clerk leaned closer, lowering his tone but not his arrogance. "Not until I see proper clearance," he said, though the ID still sat untouched on the counter. A hush rolled through the space like the first shiver before a storm. A man 2 places back whispered, "That's Congresswoman Crockett." The words slipped into the air, spreading through the terminal like wildfire. Heads turned, eyes widened, and the silence that followed was not indifference, it was recognition. The passengers were no longer looking at a tired woman in line. They were staring at a member of Congress being treated like she was no one. Jasmine felt the heat of their stares pressing into her back. She wanted to vanish to preserve her dignity without spectacle. But the longer the clerk stalled, the clearer the humiliation became. He tapped his keyboard once, then shook his head theatrically. Still nothing, he announced, his voice sharp enough to cut the quiet. Someone in the crowd gasped softly. Another raised their phone higher. The ordinary moment had become theater. The screen above the gate flashed, "Boarding." Passengers began streaming past, eyes darting from their tickets to the confrontation unfolding at the counter. Jasmine held her ground, refusing to move aside. "I need you to do your job," she said firmly. "You have my ID, my boarding pass. Scan it." Her voice carried the steadiness of someone who had fought battles much larger than this one, but inside her chest her heartbeat thundered with disbelief. The clerk leaned back, crossed his arms, and let the silence stretch again. A mother clutching her child's hand muttered, "Why are they doing this to her?" A college student in a navy hoodie whispered to no one in particular, "Isn't she supposed to be on that committee?" The recognition spread faster now, each whisper adding weight to the humiliation. And then, like a cruel punctuation mark, the loudspeaker blared, "Final boarding call for Flight 412 to Washington, D.C. Doors closing in 2 minutes." Jasmine's eyes flicked to the clock above the counter, 7:08. The flight she had rushed for, the one she needed, was slipping through her fingers while she stood trapped in a spectacle she hadn't chosen. The clerk finally picked up her pass, sliding it beneath the scanner with mock reluctance. The red light blinked, then green. The ticket was valid, But instead of handing it back, he placed it flat on the counter just beyond her reach, his smirk returning like a quiet insult. "I'm sorry," he said with false sympathy. "The door has already closed." The words landed heavier than the crowd's collective gasp. Her chest hollowed as she turned toward the glass windows, watching the jet bridge pull away from the plane. The engines rumbled to life, the wings stretching like arms ready to lift. Her seat, her chance to be where she was needed, was already sealed behind a locked door. The room erupted in divided tones, outrage, disbelief, the hiss of phones recording what everyone knew was bigger than a glitch. A man in a business suit shook his head and muttered, "Unbelievable." A teenager whispered, "They made her miss it on purpose." And somewhere in the back, a voice cut through the noise. "That's the Congresswoman. They're making an example of her." Jasmine stood still, her hands at her sides, her breathing steady, even as her insides churned. She could feel every eye on her, every lens recording her restraint. Her flight was gone, her dignity tested, and the ordinary morning had dissolved into a spectacle no one would forget. The intercom buzzed again, announcing another flight as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But for everyone standing in Gate 22B, the silence between words was filled with something heavier, the question that clung to them like static in the air. If your dignity was stripped in front of strangers, would you stay silent or fight back? The moment the jet bridge pulled away, the tension at Gate 22B did not dissolve, it detonated. Phones were already raised like a forest of glowing eyes, their lenses capturing every second that the Congresswoman stood stranded at the counter. The clerk's smirk hardened, and with it came reinforcements. 2 TSA officers walking briskly down the terminal, fluorescent vests, glinting under the harsh airport lights. Their radios hissed with static, and the crowd instinctively parted as if violence itself had been summoned into the room. Jasmine remained perfectly still, her ID still resting on the counter where the clerk had abandoned it. One officer picked it up, tilted it under the light, and barked, "Step aside, ma'am. Random review." The words echoed with the chill of rehearsed authority, but everyone watching knew randomness had nothing to do with it. Gas rippled through the line. Someone muttered, "After all that, now this?" The camera zoomed closer, and what began as humiliation at a gate was mutating into a public spectacle no one could stop. She tried to reason, calm, deliberate, her voice pitched low so as not to ignite the firestorm around her. "This is a government-issued ID. You've already confirmed my seat. This isn't protocol, it's harassment." The second officer smirked at his partner, then back at her. "Ma'am, maybe if you weren't so outspoken you wouldn't get flagged." His words slithered through the silence, and the air itself seemed to tighten. The insult wasn't just procedural, it was personal. The crowd erupted in fractured reactions. Some gasped audibly. A man in a ball cap whispered into his phone, "He just said that on record." A woman clutching her toddler glared at the officers with tears in her eyes. Yet Jasmine did not move. She inhaled once, deep and steady, as though she were anchoring herself against a storm determined to rip her apart. Inside rage clawed at her chest, begging to explode in flames. But her face remained carved in stillness, every line an act of resistance. The officers circled her like predators, rummaging through her carry-on with exaggerated force. Shoes, files, and folded clothes spilled across the floor, as if each item were evidence of guilt. The crowd groaned. Cameras panned. A man shouted from the back, "She's a congresswoman, for God's sake." One officer shot him a glare hand tightening near his belt, and the man fell silent. The display was no longer about rules. It was domination played out in slow, merciless choreography. Jasmine bent down, gathering her scattered belongings with deliberate calm. Her fingers lingered over a folded program from the funeral she was supposed to attend. The sight of it sent a blade through her chest, but she refused to let them see it cut her. Rising, she placed each item back in the bag, her posture regal in defiance of their attempts to strip her dignity. The officers whispered between themselves, shaking their heads as if mocking her restraint. The tension hit another peak when one of them waved her ID in the air and sneered, "Funny, I've seen your face before. Always protesting, always loud. Maybe it's time someone taught you where the line is." The crowd bristled, murmurs escalating into open outrage. Phones caught every word, the microphones amplifying the venom until it filled the hall like thunder. For a brief second, even the clerk at the counter looked uncertain, his smirk faltering. But Jasmine did not break. Her silence became louder than their taunts, her stillness more commanding than their aggression. The cameras captured the slight tilt of her head, the unblinking stare that told the world she would not yield. That image alone, quiet, steady, unshaken, was enough to unsettle the officers more than any outburst could have. And then came the whisper that sliced through the chaos like a knife. A child no more than 10 tugged at his mother's sleeve and asked, his voice small, but clear enough for the microphones to catch, "Why are they doing this to her?" The mother pressed her lips tight, pulling her son closer, unable to answer. The words hung in the air, echoing louder than any shout, and the crowd fell silent in reverence to the innocence of the question. Every camera caught it. Every person felt it. And in that suspended moment, the spectacle was no longer about boarding passes or random reviews. It was about dignity bleeding out in the open under the cold light of a system that thrived on silence. When injustice happens in public, does silence protect you or expose it louder? Across the rope line, an airport operations supervisor made a quick call to the emergency contact on the passenger record. The name on the screen, Franklin Rhodes. The crowd at gate 22B was still buzzing when a new figure appeared beyond the checkpoint, flanked by an airport operations supervisor and a TSA lead. Franklin Rhodes, silver-haired, broad-shouldered, moved with the clean authority of someone who belonged a temporary, sterile area escort badge clipped to his jacket. The supervisor had verified his credentials and signed him in under escort procedures. The TSA lead kept half a step behind, eyes scanning hands-free. Franklin carried no bag, no coffee, only purpose. His gaze locked on Jasmine, her belongings scattered, two officers boxing her in. The murmurs in the crowd shifted as recognition rippled outward. "That's Judge Rhodes," someone whispered, their phone trembling as they lifted it higher. Franklin had spent decades on the federal bench, his reputation carved into legal history. And now he wasn't arriving as a passenger. He was arriving as a reckoning. The clerk at the counter stiffened his smirk, collapsing under the sudden weight of authority walking toward him. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, but neither moved. Franklin reached Jasmine in a handful of long strides, his jaw tight, his voice steady, but lined with fire. "What is happening here?" he demanded, his tone carrying the resonance of years commanding courtrooms. One officer opened his mouth, fumbling for words, but Franklin's stare cut him off before sound emerged. He placed a hand gently on Jasmine's shoulder. Solidarity made flesh, then turned back to the clerk. "Explain. Now." The clerk stammered, shuffling behind the counter, clinging to the one shield he thought he had. It's policy, sir. Random review. Just procedure." His words cracked under the pressure, but he pushed forward louder now, hoping volume could disguise weakness. "We're required to ensure every passenger clears additional checks when flagged. Nothing personal." The lie fell flat. The crowd knew it. The cameras knew it. And Franklin knew it most of all. His hand tightened into a fist at his side, then slowly released the sine wave of his anger, cresting and falling into controlled precision. "Policy," he repeated, voice colder than steel. "Show me the regulation number, cite the section, produce the order." Each demand landed like a hammer strike, and with each one the silence in the terminal grew heavier. The officers shifted uncomfortably, one glancing toward the clerk as though searching for rescue. But Franklin gave them none. He stepped closer, his frame towering, his words sharp enough to slice through excuses. "You detained a sitting member of Congress. You humiliated her in public. You rifled through her belongings like common thieves. And now you hide behind a word policy without a single statute to stand on." His voice rose not with panic, but with thunderous clarity. The crowd erupted in murmurs of agreement. A man near the back shouted, "Yeah, show the law." A woman clapped once sharply like a gavel striking wood. Phones caught every syllable, the feed already surging through social media streams. For the first time, the officers looked less like enforcers and more like men cornered by their own arrogance. Jasmine, still silent, stood straighter at her husband's side. Her stillness in Chapter 2 had been resistance. Now paired with Franklin's fire, it became solidarity. Two forces, restraint and defiance, merged into one unbreakable front. The clerk's hands shook slightly as he fumbled with papers on the counter, stalling buying time he didn't have. Franklin leaned forward, his voice dropping into a tone that carried the gravity of final judgment. Names, badge numbers. Now. The words struck like a verdict. The officers froze, their authority stripped bare, the weight of accountability pressing down with the force of an entire courtroom behind him. The silence that followed was not ordinary silence. It was thick, suffocating a silence that made even the intercom hesitate to announce its next flight. The crowd stopped breathing. Every camera lens zoomed tighter. The clerk's lips parted, but no sound came. The officers looked at one another, then back at Franklin, their hands twitching near their IDs, but unwilling to move. In that frozen moment, the spectacle transformed again. It was no longer humiliation, no longer harassment. It was confrontation incarnate. Law versus prejudice, justice versus abuse. A husband standing not just for his wife, but for the principle that dignity was not negotiable. And yet beneath the roar of solidarity, a question lingered in the air like smoke after a gunshot. When those you love are humiliated, do you watch quietly or risk everything by stepping in? In the background, the yellow airport ops lanyard on Franklin's escort flashed in frame proof he hadn't simply strolled past security. The silence after Franklin's demand still lingered when the first notification buzzed in the crowd. A student in the second row lowered her phone, eyes wide at the screen. "It's already on Twitter," she whispered, her voice trembling, as if she had just spotted lightning before thunder. Around her, others checked their feeds, and within seconds, Gate 22B was no longer just a terminal, it was a broadcast studio feeding a nation. Hashtags began crawling across timelines. Hashtag Gate 22B. Hashtag Stand With Her. Each post carried shaky footage, but the rawness made it undeniable. TikTok clips stitched the child's innocent question, why are they doing this to her, with the sight of Franklin towering over the officers. Instagram reels looped the clerk's smirk until it became a meme of arrogance. Twitter erupted with a storm of outrage, disbelief, and solidarity, each retweet spreading like wildfire across states and time zones. For passengers still standing in the terminal, the surreal realization struck: they were no longer bystanders. They were witnesses shaping history in real time. Jasmine felt the shift before she saw it. Dozens of cameras turned from the officers to her lenses, focusing not on the harassment, but on her stillness. Fear knotted in her stomach, a primal urge to escape, to vanish, before the tidal wave of exposure swallowed her whole. But she stood frozen, aware that every flicker of expression would be dissected, replayed, magnified. She thought of her niece watching these clips before school. She thought of the funeral she had already missed now, overshadowed by humiliation turned viral. The airline staff scrambled, huddling behind the counter with their radios crackling. One supervisor hissed into the mouthpiece, "We need to control this now." Another muttered, "PR team, get on it. Release a statement. Call it a misunderstanding." But the footage didn't care about statements. The footage spoke louder than polished excuses ever could. Each second they delayed, another million viewers joined the storm. Franklin placed a steady hand on Jasmine's arm, grounding her against the rising tide. "They're going to spin this," he murmured, his jaw tight. "Decide now. Do you want to hide, or do you want to own it?" His words cut to the bone. She had spent her career speaking truth in courtrooms and chambers, but this was raw, personal, and unforgiving. Her instinct screamed to retreat, to protect herself from the avalanche of judgment. Yet another voice rose inside her, quiet but insistent, "If not now." When outside the terminal, news vans screeched into position, satellite dishes unfurling toward the sky. Reporters sprinted through automatic doors, cameras already rolling, their voices breathless as they shouted into microphones. Breaking now from Dallas Love Field sources, confirmed Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett has been detained in what witnesses describe as a targeted act of humiliation. The words echoed across cable networks within minutes, the chyron burning across screens. Congresswoman detained at airport. Inside, passengers gasped as their phones lit with CNN's push notification. The crowd surged closer, some chanting, "Stand with her," while others whispered nervously about missing their flights. The ordinary machinery of travel boarding calls, luggage carts, security announcements had collapsed under the weight of spectacle. Dallas Love Field had become the epicenter of a national reckoning. Jasmine's chest tightened as a boom mic swung toward her. A reporter shouting over the noise, "Congresswoman, do you want to respond? Do you believe this was racial profiling?" Dozens of microphones thrust forward like weapons demanding an answer. Her pulse hammered. To speak meant to ignite the fire. To stay silent meant to surrender the narrative. Her eyes darted toward Franklin, who met her gaze without flinching. "It's your choice," he said softly, but the gravity in his voice told her what was at stake. The officers shifted uneasily, now aware the cameras had turned them into villains. One muttered, "We didn't detain her. She just missed her flight." The lie was thin, shredded by the evidence already circling online. The crowd erupted in boos, their voices drowning out the intercom. Someone shouted, "We saw it! You stopped her!" Another voice cried, "The world saw it too." The officers retreated a step, the weight of exposure heavier than any badge they wore. Jasmine straightened her stillness, transforming into something sharper. She took one breath, then another, each inhale a decision. Fear clawed at her ribs, but defiance rose higher, fueled by the chant building behind her. "Stand with her, stand with her." She looked into the nearest camera lens, her eyes steady, her voice calm, but unyielding. "Dignity is not a privilege," she said. "It's a right." The crowd roared the sound, echoing off steel beams and glass walls like thunder rolling across an open sky. Outside anchors leaned into their earpieces as producers shouted updates. "We have her statement, clip it loop, it run at top of the hour." In Manhattan, Los Angeles, Chicago, millions of screens lit with her face, her words cutting through the noise. Social feeds surged again, hashtags climbing to the top of trending charts. Hashtag #StandWith, her broke into the global top 5 within 30 minutes, but with every cheer a shadow loomed. Airline executives dialed conference calls in hushed tones, ordering teams to draft counter-narratives. Anonymous accounts flooded timelines with claims it was all staged, that she refused to follow rules. The backlash was fast, calculated, and merciless. Jasmine scrolled briefly through her phone, each insult another cut. Loudmouth. Playing victim. Entitlement queen. Her throat tightened, the temptation to vanish clawing at her again. Franklin leaned close, his voice low but firm. "They'll try to bury you with noise. But remember, noise isn't truth." Jasmine closed her eyes for a heartbeat, grounding herself against the chaos. She thought of the child's whisper still echoing in her mind. She thought of her niece, of the women who had sent her letters before about their own silent humiliations. Slowly, her fear loosened its grip, replaced by something steadier: resolve. The terminal was now a battlefield of narratives, every word, every silence, every glance magnified beyond recognition. Jasmine stood at the center, torn between the safety of silence and the risk of testimony. Cameras swarmed closer, red lights blinking like targeting lasers. The world demanded an answer, but only she could decide what story it would tell. And in the unbearable tension of that moment, one question pressed harder than all the rest. Do you tell your own story, or let others define it for you? 48 hours later, the marble halls of the Capitol vibrated with tension. Reporters packed shoulder to shoulder outside the Oversight Committee chamber, microphones and cameras aimed at the double doors like artillery waiting to fire. Headlines had already set the tone: Congresswoman detained at airport, dignity denied at gate 22B. Now the nation wanted answers, not just about one woman, but about the systems that allowed humiliation to masquerade as policy. Inside the chamber, the air was heavier still. Airline executives sat stiff in their suits, faces powdered under the glare of television lights. Their lawyers whispered rehearsed lines: clerical error, standard review, unfortunate oversight. At the opposite end of the table, Jasmine Crockett adjusted the microphone before her. Every movement deliberate, her posture controlled. The humiliation of Dallas Love Field still clung to her skin, but here beneath the dome of power, she would not let it define her. The chairman struck his gavel. This committee convenes to examine the events at Dallas Love Field and determine whether bias or misconduct played a role. His voice echoed across the room, but it was the silence afterward that carried weight. Dozens of cameras zoomed in on Jasmine, the image of stillness once again transformed into defiance. The first executive leaned into his microphone, voice dripping with false regret. "We deeply regret the incident. It was an isolated clerical error, an unfortunate glitch in the system." His words were smooth, rehearsed, designed to dissolve outrage into paperwork. He gestured to the cameras as though seeking sympathy. We serve millions of passengers every year without issue. To suggest otherwise, the chairman cut him short. Yet footage shows two officers mocking a member of Congress. That is not clerical. Murmurs spread across the chamber, reporters scribbling furiously. The executive shifted uncomfortably, his mask of calm cracking. Our employees acted independently, not company policy. Jasmine's lips tightened, the memory of her ID held aloft like contraband flashing in her mind. Her humiliation burned again, but instead of consuming her, it ignited something sharper. She leaned forward, her voice low but resonant. If it was random, why was my name already flagged? Why did a clerk smirk before a single key was pressed? Her questions landed with precision, each one slicing through the executive's armor. The cameras caught every word, every flicker of his discomfort. The committee pressed harder. Congresswoman, do you have evidence this was not isolated? The chamber fell silent, the weight of expectation pressing down. Jasmine opened a folder, her hands steady, her eyes unblinking. Inside were letters not from lawyers or staffers, but from ordinary Americans who had flooded her office after seeing the footage. She lifted the first page. This is from Angela, a school teacher in Ohio. She writes, I was pulled aside last year for no reason other than my headscarf. They searched my bags in front of my students. I cried in silence. Jasmine paused, letting the words echo. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, the weight of empathy settling like a storm cloud. The second letter trembled slightly in her hands, but her voice did not falter. This is from David, a veteran. After serving my country overseas, I was treated like a threat at my own airport. They emptied my uniform bag in front of strangers. I never spoke about it until I saw what they did to you. The chamber erupted in murmurs, the pain of countless humiliations, now spilling into the open. One by one, she read the voices of the unseen, the ignored, the silenced. Each story stacked upon the other, a mountain of testimony the executives could not dismiss as clerical. The crowd leaned forward, reporters nearly falling from their chairs as they realized the story had shifted. It was no longer about one woman, it was about all of them. And then the twist arrived, carried not by Jasmine's hand, but by a phone buzzing in the back row. A clerk, pale and sweating, rushed forward with a folded sheet of paper, whispering urgently to the chairman. He scanned it once, his face tightening, before sliding it down the table toward Jasmine. Her eyes flicked across the page, and for a heartbeat her breath caught. The memo was blunt, stripped of euphemism, a command written in bureaucratic ink flag. Her for secondary at all costs. Gasps tore through the chamber. The executives froze, their polished masks shattering in real time. Reporters bolted upright, phones flying to capture the words before the page even cooled. Jasmine held it aloft, her voice cutting like a blade. This is not a glitch. This is not clerical. This is targeted. The silence that followed was volcanic, the kind that signaled eruption rather than calm. Franklin's hand tightened into a fist at the back of the room, pride flashing across his face. The cameras zoomed in closer, capturing Jasmine's eyes ablaze, not with humiliation, but with righteous control. The chairman's gavel struck again, but it was drowned out by the roar outside the chamber. Protesters, students, ordinary citizens, chanting the hashtags that had begun at Gate 22B. The chamber itself trembled with their voices as if the building had become an amplifier for the truth. Jasmine looked down at the letters spread before her, then back at the memo clenched in her hand. She felt the weight of every unseen story pressing against her chest, demanding release. This wasn't just her fight anymore. It never had been. She leaned into the microphone, her voice quiet but shaking with power. If they can target me with cameras everywhere, what do you think happens to those with no witness? How many suffer in silence while systems call it policy? Her question pierced through the lights, the cameras, the marble walls reaching beyond the chamber and into the living rooms of a nation already holding its breath. If systems target you in silence, how many others are suffering unseen? The hearing was over, but the echoes followed Jasmine home, like shadows she could not shake. The marble grandeur of the Capitol gave way to the quiet hum of her living room, where the TV screen replayed clips she no longer wanted to see. The words "flag her for secondary at all costs" crawled across the bottom of every broadcast, anchoring themselves into the national psyche. Yet in the stillness of her home, the silence felt heavier than the roar of the chamber. Franklin sat across from her, his glasses perched low as he scanned the day's avalanche of headlines. His voice carried the weight of a verdict, calm but unflinching. This isn't just about you anymore. He looked up, meeting her tired eyes. It's about every person who's ever been told they don't belong. You've become the line they're all watching. The truth of it settled on her chest like a stone pressing against wounds that had barely begun to scab. The doorbell rang sharp against the quiet. Franklin rose first, retrieving the small pile of mail waiting outside. At the top sat an envelope thick and scrawled with jagged handwriting. He slid it across the table toward her, his jaw clenched. Jasmine hesitated, then tore it open. Inside, block letters screamed across the page, "You should have stayed quiet. Next time you won't walk away." Her hands trembled, the threat bleeding into her veins like ice. More followed, emails, messages, anonymous accounts flooding her phone with venom. Some called her a hero, others a fraud. Half the country seemed to stand with her, while the other half sharpened their knives. Each notification was a blade slicing into her resolve. She scrolled through them late into the night, the glow of the screen etching exhaustion into her face. Franklin placed a hand gently on hers, grounding her. "Don't let them drown you in noise," he whispered. But the noise was relentless. By morning, exhaustion had hollowed her eyes, her strength stretched thin across too many fronts. She replayed the footage of herself at Gate 22B, the humiliation now etched into history. Each frame felt like a scar reopened. She had chosen stillness over rage, control over collapse. But the memory played on a loop, punishing her in private. She pressed her palms against her temples, wishing she could silence it all. Franklin stood in the doorway, his voice carrying the steadiness she no longer felt. "You can't keep reliving it," he said. "If you do, they've already won." Jasmine lifted her head, her eyes rimmed red, but burning with something sharper. "It's not just the humiliation," she replied. "It's knowing half the country thinks I deserved it." Her words cracked, a rare fracture in the armor she wore before the world. The day stretched on the house, filling with the weight of divided voices. Friends called with messages of support. Strangers sent threats in the same breath. The air itself felt heavy with contradiction, admiration tangled with hatred, solidarity woven with suspicion. Jasmine carried it all, her body a vessel for every opinion, every wound, every whispered doubt. The strength she had shown in public drained away in private, leaving her vulnerable in a way she had not felt in years. Late in the evening, as the sun bled orange across the horizon, her niece padded softly into the room. The girl's wide eyes carried a question heavier than her small frame should bear. She sat beside Jasmine, clutching a worn notebook, hesitant before she spoke. "Aunt Jasmine, does this mean I'll be treated like that too?" The words hit harder than any headline, sharper than any threat. Jasmine's breath caught her chest tightening with a pain no chamber, no committee, no courtroom could prepare her for. She turned to her niece, searching for words, but none came. The child's innocence collided with the reality Jasmine had tried so hard to shield her from, and in that collision lay a truth she could not escape. Her humiliation was no longer hers alone. It had become generational, echoing forward into the lives of those who would inherit the fight. Tears burned at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them back, refusing to let despair answer in her place. She wrapped her arm around the girl's shoulders, holding her close, feeling the weight of legacy pressing down. In the silence that followed, she realized the question wasn't just from a child, it was from a generation watching to see what came next. And in that silence, one question rose above all the noise, sharper than threats, louder than cheers. When your pain becomes generational, what do you owe to those watching you? The question from her niece still echoed in Jasmine's ears when the first rally footage appeared on her screen. A pastor in Detroit stood before his congregation, voice thundering as he replayed the clips from Gate 22B. "If they can treat a congresswoman this way, what do you think they'll do to you?" The pews erupted in applause, parishioners rising to their feet, their voices lifting higher than stained glass could contain. That clip spread like wildfire, carried on hashtags already burning across the nation. Soon after, students marched across a college campus in Austin, their chants ricocheting between buildings. "Stand with her. Stand with her." Homemade signs waved above the crowd, some painted hastily in dorm rooms, others etched with careful calligraphy. A veteran in a wheelchair rolled at the front line, holding a faded flag, his voice cracking as he shouted, "Never again." The raw chorus of faith, youth, and sacrifice braided together into something unstoppable. Meanwhile, the airline scrambled to rewrite the narrative. Polished ads flooded televisions, their voiceovers syrupy with contrition. "We care about dignity. We care about respect." The images showed smiling attendants in clean airplanes, but the words rang hollow. Viewers posted clips side by side, the empty apologies against the raw humiliation caught on phones. Every ad meant to bury the scandal, only fanned the flames hotter. Jasmine watched from her living room, the volume low, her pulse loud in her ears. For days she had chosen silence, letting others speak while she nursed her exhaustion. But as the rally swelled, she realized something deeper: silence had given the story its power. But now her voice was needed to guide it. To remain quiet was to let strangers carry the burden alone. To speak was to join them, to validate the roar rising in her name. Franklin stood by the window, the blinds cracked open as another crowd gathered outside her home. They carried candles, signed songs. Their voices rose in unison, chanting the hashtags that had spilled from social media into the streets. "They're waiting for you," Franklin said quietly. His words were not a push, but a truth. Jasmine closed her eyes, inhaled deeply, and felt the weight of their trust pressing against her ribs. The next morning she stepped onto her porch. Cameras swiveled instantly, but it was the people she focused on: the mother clutching her child, the student holding a megaphone, the veteran in uniform despite the cold. She raised her hand, not in command but in acknowledgement, and the crowd hushed as if a single switch had been flipped. For a moment she let the silence stretch her stillness, again becoming power. Then she spoke. "They tried to make me small," she began, her voice steady. "But what happened to me has happened to so many of you. For too long they've counted on our silence. Today we break it together." The crowd erupted, a wave of cheers cresting and crashing against the walls of her neighborhood. Reporters shouted questions, but they were drowned out by the chants echoing louder. "Stand with her, stand with her." By midday, the scene shifted back to Dallas Love Field. Thousands gathered at the terminal, where humiliation had first unfolded. Pastors led prayers over bullhorns, students painted chalk slogans across the sidewalks, veterans saluted from the curb. Police lined the entrances, tense and watchful, but the protesters did not flinch. Their voices built a living wall stronger than any gate or badge. Jasmine arrived late in the afternoon, escorted by Franklin, her hair pulled back, her steps deliberate. The moment she appeared, the chants surged into thunder. She walked to the same gate where the clerk had smirked, the same space where a child had whispered the truth. Now it was filled with thousands of strangers who had turned humiliation into defiance. She stood on a makeshift platform, the terminal glass behind her gleaming in the setting sun. The roar was deafening, but when she raised her hand again, silence fell like a curtain. She scanned the crowd faces, lifted eyes burning with hope and anger woven into one. "I was one voice when this began," she said, her tone low but caring. "Now look at us, thousands strong, millions watching. This is what happens when we refuse to be silent." Her words hung in the air, sharp and unyielding, and then the chant erupted again, louder than ever before. "Stand with her, stand with her." The ground seemed to tremble under the weight of their voices. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment, broadcasting live as the hashtag jumped to the top of global trends. Airline executives watching from corporate boardrooms knew they had lost control. The narrative was no longer theirs, it belonged to the people and to the woman they had tried to humiliate. Jasmine stood tall on the platform, her exhaustion melting beneath the heat of unity. For the first time in days, hope surged through her veins, carried not by solitude, but by solidarity. She felt her niece's small hand slip into hers, the girl's eyes wide with awe, at the sea of voices rising in unison. In that moment, Jasmine knew this was no longer about her pain. It was about the movement it had sparked. As the chants shook the terminal glass and echoed across the city, a single question formed in the air, unspoken yet undeniable. When strangers stand for you, how do you stand for them? The chants outside Dallas Love Field still echoed in Jasmine's memory when the next blow landed, not from the airline, not from the crowd, but from within the walls of power she thought she understood. A folder slid across her desk in a quiet Capitol office, its pages stamped confidential. Franklin sat across from her, his face grave. "You need to see this," he said, his voice low, each word weighted like stone. Jasmine flipped the first page and her pulse jolted. The directive wasn't written by faceless airline bureaucrats. It was addressed to federal liaisons signed by colleagues she had once trusted. In black and white print, the words pierced sharper than any insult at Gate 22B flag, her for secondary at all costs. The letters bled betrayal. She felt her stomach twist as recognition struck the same people who had shaken her hand in chambers, who had smiled for cameras beside her, had sharpened the knives now buried in her back. Her office was silent, but for the hum of a desk lamp. She stared at the signatures, each one a fracture in the fragile trust she had held. One name in particular seared against her eyes, a fellow lawmaker she had defended in past storms, a man who had once called her sister in private. Her chest tightened, fury pressing against her ribs like fire trapped in glass. "They made me a target," she whispered the words, tasting like ash. Franklin's jaw tightened. This was never just an airline. This was orchestrated. They wanted to make an example of you, and they used the system to do it. His tone carried no surprise, only sorrow. Jasmine pressed her palms against the desk, steadying herself as waves of betrayal crashed over her. The humiliation at the airport had been brutal, but this cut deeper. It wasn't an enemy's attack. It was family turning into traitors. The revelation spread through whispers in the Capitol like a virus. Reporters had not yet seen the memo, but the tension in the hallways betrayed its weight. Colleagues avoided her gaze, their smiles brittle, their greetings clipped. Jasmine walked past them, her heels striking the marble floor like a drumbeat of defiance, but her heart hammered with rage. She had fought opponents in open hearings, endured insults from political enemies, but betrayal from those beside her felt like poison, spreading unseen. That evening, she summoned one of the names from the memo. The confrontation took place behind closed doors in a dim committee chamber, the overhead lights buzzing faintly. The colleague entered with practiced calm, his tie loosened, his eyes feigning surprise. "Jasmine," he began smoothly, "I hope we can clear up some misunderstanding." She rose slowly from her chair, holding the memo in her hand like a blade. "Misunderstanding," her voice was low, but fury coiled inside every syllable. She laid the paper flat on the table between them, her finger pressing against his signature. "You signed the memo." The mask slipped. His jaw tightened. His eyes darted away for a heartbeat too long. "It was nothing personal," he muttered, his voice brittle. "It was about optics, pressure from leadership keeping the narrative under control. Each excuse deepened the wound, each word confirming the betrayal." Jasmine leaned forward, her stare unblinking, her voice cutting sharper than any gavel. "You humiliated me. You endangered me. You betrayed every person who looks to this chamber for justice. And you dare call it optics?" The silence that followed was suffocating, heavier than any chamber full of cameras. The man shifted uneasily, his practiced confidence cracking under her fury. "You don't understand the pressure," he stammered. But Jasmine did. She understood perfectly that power had chosen cowardice over loyalty, betrayal over solidarity. Her chest heaved with controlled breath, fury balanced on the edge of restraint. Betrayal burned hotter than humiliation ever had. It wasn't just an attack on her dignity. It was proof that even within the fortress of democracy, rot lived behind smiling faces. For the first time since Gate 22B, her knees trembled not from weakness, but from the sheer force of betrayal, trying to break her bones from the inside out. She straightened, reclaiming control, her voice dropping into lethal calm. "History will remember what you did, not as strategy, not as politics, as betrayal." Her words settled between them like iron chains, binding him to the weight of his own treachery. He said nothing. He couldn't. The silence was his confession. Outside the closed chamber, the Capitol carried on speeches, delivered votes, cast cameras, chasing headlines. But inside that room, the fracture had been laid bare. Allies had become enemies cloaked in familiar suits, and Jasmine knew the fight ahead would not just be against those who mocked her openly, but those who smiled while slipping knives into her back. She gathered the memo, her hands steady, now her heart a furnace of rage and resolve. Franklin's warning replayed in her mind. This isn't just about you anymore. He was right. The betrayal was bigger than her humiliation. It was a mirror reflecting the rot at the core of power. And as she stepped into the hallway, the question thundered louder than any chant reverberating through her bones. What hurts more, enemies in plain sight or betrayal by those beside you? The ink on the leaked memo had barely dried in public memory before the media machine devoured it whole. By nightfall, Jasmine's face was plastered across primetime screens, framed by bold chirons, humiliation or security racism or protocol. Each network carved the story to fit its narrative, split-screen debates raging with pundits, speaking over one another like boxers trading blows. Her humiliation, her betrayal, her fight, it had become entertainment for a nation addicted to spectacle. Jasmine sat in a studio green room, makeup powdered over exhaustion earpiece, crackling with the countdown to live broadcast. On the monitor across from her, two talking heads argued furiously. One insisted she was weaponizing victimhood, the other fired back that she was proof of systemic rot. Her jaw tightened, fingers curled around the armrest. This wasn't a courtroom where facts were weighed. It was an arena where sound bites were swords and she was about to be thrown into the pit. The host's voice boomed, "Joining us now, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett." The split screen blinked, her face appearing beside two opponents primed for battle. They pounced before she could speak. "Wasn't this just standard procedure?" one sneered. "If anything, doesn't her reaction make the country less safe?" Jasmine's chest flared with anger, but she steadied her breath. Rage would feed their narrative. Stillness had once saved her. Now she had to learn control in a new arena. At first she stumbled. The cacophony drowned her words, each attempt at nuance sliced apart by interruptions. Her answers, thoughtful but too long, were cut to seconds stripped of context. Headlines appeared online within minutes: Crockett dodges security question, Crockett plays race card again. She scrolled through her phone between segments, fury and despair intertwining as strangers debated her dignity in comment threads. The betrayal of colleagues had felt like poison. This felt like dismemberment in real time. But as the hours wore on, something shifted. She studied the battlefield unfolding on every screen, noticed how the pundits who dominated didn't win by truth, but by brevity. She thought of Franklin's words, "Don't let them drown you in noise." She realized survival here meant not matching their volume, but condensing her truth until it was undeniable. She straightened in her chair, her eyes sharper, her voice calmer. The next night she entered a different studio with a plan. The host lobbed the familiar trap. Congresswoman, critics say this isn't about racism at all, just random review. Isn't it dangerous to claim otherwise? Jasmine didn't flinch. She leaned into the microphone, her tone quiet but razor-edged. Dignity isn't optional, it's the baseline. 17 seconds. That was all it took. The studio went silent, the pundits frozen mid-attack. The words struck like a gavel, concise enough to pierce through noise, powerful enough to echo beyond the set. Within minutes, the clip hit Twitter, racking up millions of views. Students looped it into TikTok edits. Pastors wove it into sermons. Veterans repeated it in VFW halls. The phrase became more than a rebuttal, it became a rallying cry. Meanwhile, networks scrambled to reframe. Some ran the line as defiance, others as arrogance. But the clip outpaced every spin. It lived on phones, on feeds, and whispers across kitchen tables. A teenager in Chicago scribbled it on his backpack. A nurse in Phoenix taped it to her locker. Even those who disagreed couldn't stop repeating it. The power of a 1,000-word testimony had been distilled into a sentence that refused to die. Jasmine watched the clip herself in the quiet of her office, her exhaustion still raw, but her eyes alive with something new. For the first time since Gate 22B, she felt control returning, not because she had silenced the storm, but because she had learned to ride it. Her truth, sharpened into steel, had cut through where speeches never could. She leaned back in her chair, the noise of pundits still raging faintly on TV, but their voices no longer defined her. Outside, rallies swelled again, voices chanting not just her name, but her words. Dignity isn't optional, it's the baseline. It rang against courthouse steps, across campuses, through city streets. The phrase had leapt beyond her control, but she didn't resist. She had given the truth its shape. Now the people carried it forward. Yet as the chant thundered across the country, a question gnawed at her. The soundbite had won the battle, But headlines could twist anything, strip context, reduce humanity to slogans. She had turned her pain into a weapon once more. But at what cost? The spectacle was never ending, and the truth was fragile in its grip. When truth is reduced to headlines, can it still hold power? The chamber was packed beyond capacity. Reporters filled every row of the gallery, cameras perched like hawk's lenses, trained on the witness table. Airline executives sat stiff in polished suits flanked by DHS officials, whose faces revealed nothing but calculated calm. And beside them in the second row, two whistleblowers sat with trembling hands, their eyes darting nervously toward the door. The air itself felt combustible, as if one spark could set the room ablaze. Jasmine adjusted her microphone, her hands steady though her pulse roared in her ears. She had faced hearings before, but never one this sharp, this personal. The scars of Gate 22B had become a national wound, and now the question before Congress was not just about her humiliation, it was about whether injustice had been built into the rules themselves. The gavel struck and silence dropped like a curtain. The chairman's voice was measured but taut. This hearing will determine whether federal systems in partnership with airlines deliberately targeted minority officials for secondary screening. All witnesses are reminded they are under oath. His gaze swept across the table, pausing on the executives whose smiles had already begun to crack. The tension coiled tighter with every second of silence. The first executive leaned forward, reciting words rehearsed in conference rooms. "We regret what happened to Congresswoman Crockett. However, the incident was the result of a technical miscommunication. Nothing more." His tone was smooth, but his hands betrayed him, fingers drumming nervously against the table. Reporters scribbled, unimpressed. Jasmine tilted her head, her eyes sharp as glass. Then came the DHS official, his voice deep but hollow. "Our procedures are designed for safety, not prejudice. Any suggestion otherwise is misleading." The words rang sterile, stripped of humanity. Jasmine's lips curved into the faintest trace of a smile, not amusement, but recognition. This was the same dance, the same denial wrapped in bureaucratic armor. And then the first whistleblower spoke. A young man, barely 30, his voice shaking as he adjusted the microphone. "I worked in the compliance division. I've seen the memos. We were told to flag certain individuals for secondary, not because of security threats, but because of who they were. Members of Congress, judges, activists." Gasps rippled through the chamber. One executive shifted violently in his chair, glaring daggers at the witness, but the young man pressed on. "We were told to make examples." The words detonated like dynamite. The crowd erupted in murmurs, reporters shouting over one another, as the chairman pounded the gavel for order. Jasmine leaned forward, her voice calm but razor-sharp. "Do you have proof of this directive?" The young man nodded, sliding a folder across the table. The chairman opened it, his face blanching as he scanned the text. Slowly, he passed it down the row until it reached Jasmine's hands. She opened the memo. Black letters stark against white paper stared back at her. Her stomach clenched, but her voice did not waver as she began to read aloud. "All minority officials deemed outspoken should be subjected to enhanced review. Make examples of them." The chamber gasped as one. The words echoed against marble heavy as chains. The executives tried to protest, voices rising in frantic denial. That's not official policy, taken out of context. But their excuses dissolved under the roar of cameras, the fury of lawmakers, the disbelief of citizens watching live across the nation. Jasmine's voice cut through them, all steady, commanding. "This isn't a glitch. This isn't a mistake. This is systemic humiliation written into the rules." Fear churned at first her chest tight as the reality of exposure settled in. But then revelation surged higher, the truth no longer whispered, but shouted into history. The crowd in the gallery rose to their feet, some clapping, others shouting, the emotion spilling over in waves. The whistleblowers leaned back, tears in their eyes, their burden finally spoken aloud. Justice, fragile but visible, flickered into the chamber. For the first time since Dallas Love Field, Jasmine felt not just defiance, but vindication. She lowered the memo, her voice quiet now but deadly in its precision. When power writes injustice into law, it takes courage, not excuses, to erase it. Her words lingered in the silence that followed, heavier than any gavel. The camera zoomed closer, capturing her face, capturing the paper, capturing history in motion. Across the country, living rooms buzzed, office break rooms froze, and students leaned forward over cafeteria tables. A nation had witnessed humiliation at Gate 22B, but now it witnessed truth unveiled under oath. And in the stillness that followed, one question rose above the chaos, unshakable. If injustice is written into the rules, who has the courage to erase it? The courthouse doors groaned open, spilling a beam of afternoon light across the marble floor. Jasmine stepped forward, her heels striking against the stone with deliberate calm. Reporters surged instantly, their microphones raised like bayonets, voices crashing together in a cacophony. "Congresswoman, do you feel vindicated? Was this justice or politics? Do you have a message for your colleagues?" The storm of sound battered her from all sides, but she did not lift her voice. Instead, she kept moving each step, measured each breath steady. The crowd pressed against barricades, phones held high, cameras flashing like lightning strikes. Franklin walked just behind her, his gaze steady, his presence silent but unyielding. She could feel the weight of the memo in her briefcase, the proof of systemic betrayal, but she had no need to wave it in the air. The truth had already spoken for itself. Her silence unsettled the reporters more than any speech could have. They shouted louder their questions, sharper, hoping to pierce the wall of calm she carried. But Jasmine's face was unreadable, her pace unbroken. What they wanted was spectacle, a victory lap, a triumphant soundbite to package for the evening news. What she chose instead was gravity, the quiet strength of a woman who knew that dignity didn't need to shout. On the courthouse steps, the air shifted. The chants began low, rising from a small cluster of students gathered at the front of the crowd. "Stand with her! Stand with her!" Their voices climbed higher, pulling more people into the rhythm. Within seconds, the plaza shook with the roar, thousands of throats carrying the words that had traveled from Gate 22B to this moment. Jasmine paused, her eyes scanning the sea of faces. And then she saw it. A child no older than 10 hoisted onto her father's shoulders, clutching a handmade sign scrawled in bold, uneven letters. "Respect is the baseline." The words hung in the air like a banner, pure in their simplicity, uncorrupted by politics or spin. The crowd erupted again, clapping, cheering, tears streaking faces hardened by days of outrage. Jasmine felt her chest tighten, not with pain this time, but with something deeper, vindication, without vanity. She raised her hand once, a palm open, not to silence the crowd, but to thank them. The chant softened into a reverent hush. Her lips parted slightly as if to speak, but she stopped herself. There was no need. The child's sign had said it all. Instead, she let the silence stretch, let it breathe, let it carry the weight of everything that had unfolded. Cameras zoomed in, recording the quiet moment that would outlast every headline. Franklin stepped closer, his voice just for her. "They wanted to shrink you," he murmured, pride glinting in his eyes. "Instead, you grew larger than they could contain." She didn't answer, but the truth of it reverberated inside her. The humiliation, the betrayal, the spectacle, it had been meant to diminish her. Yet in the crucible of exposure, she had become something else. Not just a woman at a gate, not just a target, a symbol that could not be erased. As she descended the final step, the crowd's chant swelled again, filling the plaza with sound that rolled across the city like thunder. Jasmine glanced once more at the child, with the sign imprinting the image in her memory. The future was not in the cameras, nor the headlines, nor the polished statements of power. It was in the raw truth carried on poster board by a child too young to know how much weight his words would bear. The cameras caught her, walking away, her silhouette framed by sunlight cutting through the clouds. The networks would scramble for narration, but none could capture the stillness, the restraint, the quiet power of that departure. In living rooms across America, viewers leaned forward, sensing that they weren't watching politics. They were witnessing something human, something unforgettable. And over the footage, her voice would linger, not as a speech, but as a reflection carried like a whisper into the national conscience. They tried to shrink her. Instead, the nation remembered her. The question left hanging was no longer for the officials, the airlines, or the pundits. It was for every person who had watched, who had felt the sting of humiliation, who had seen dignity tested in plain view. In your own life, when dignity is tested, will you let silence define you, or will you rise? Life teaches us that dignity is not a luxury. It is the ground we all stand on. In this story, Jasmine Crockett faced humiliation and public betrayal in private and relentless scrutiny in the media. Yet she chose calm over rage, silence over noise, and truth over spin. Her journey reminds us that strength is not measured in how loud we shout, but in how firmly we stand when others try to make us small. For those of us over 50, this message runs deep. We have lived through decades of change challenges and moments where our worth was questioned at work and our communities, sometimes even in our own families. We know the sting of being overlooked, yet we also know the quiet power of persistence, integrity, and example. Our dignity has always been our baseline, and it is our responsibility to pass that truth on to the next generation. So the lesson is clear. When life tests your dignity, choose to rise, even if rising means standing still with unshaken resolve. In your own life, when others try to diminish you, will you let silence define your worth, or will you stand tall and remind them that respect is the baseline? Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything, like subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.